There you go. All right. So the Lord be with you.
And
And
also
also with you.
Yeah.
Lift up your hearts.
we lift them
Lift
to
them
the
to the
Lord.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
It is
It
right
is
to
right
It's
to
right
give
to
thanks
give
and
thanks.
praise.
It is right and a joyous thing, even on a cold Tuesday night, to give thanks to the Lord. So I think the worst of our absolute cold weather is now gone. Got to loop through. Can you guys hear me or hear an echo? Okay, Kendra, this time I need you to mute, and let's see if that happens. Okay, all right. It's just that's how life works. Welcome to Zoom. But I think we're past the worst of it. I'm hoping it's starting to recede all over the country as well. So we'll just keep that in prayer for our devotion. Going to read not words of Augustine, but another description. And to do it, if you look at the PowerPoint slide, you'll see a kind of area that's actually in Algiers. This was part of Hippo and part of the church and the church area that Augustine supervised. Interesting enough, a bishop would actually have exercise of sort of all the religious activities within the city, not just his own church, but it would be more sort of overseeing other aspects of the life of the church within the city, whether it be chapels or other types of things. And so continuing sort of with Augustine's dealing with the care of the poor and church finances, first thing that Harmless writes, he says that Augustine largely delegated to others the financial administration of the church. In the following passage, Posidonius, the same gentleman we heard from a couple of weeks ago, offers an overview of Augustine's policies. And so this is from his life of St. Augustine that we read this excerpt. And so Posidonius writes, he says, the care of the church buildings and all its property, Augustine assigned and entrusted in turn to more capable clerics, for he never held the key nor wore a ring, but all receipts and expenditures were recorded by these household overseers. At the end of the year, the accounts were read to him so that he might know how much was received and how much was spent, and also what balance remained. In many cases, he took the word of the overseer rather than investigate its veracity by actual proof. He never wished to buy a house, land, or a farm. However, if anything of the kind was donated, perchance, or left as a legacy, he did not refuse it, but insisted that the gift be accepted. Still, we know that he did refuse some legacies, not because they could not be used by the poor, but because it seemed right and just that the children, parents, or relatives of the deceased should own them, even though that was not the will of the deceased. New buildings Augustine never desired, avoiding entanglements of his soul in them, because he wanted it always free from all temporal annoyance. Sam, I'm not sure how Augustine would view frozen pipes as a result of that. Continuing. Nonetheless, he did not prohibit those who wanted to build them unless their plans were too extravagant. Meanwhile, if his church needed money, he told the Christian people that he had nothing to give to the poor. For the benefit of captives and the large number of needy, he ordered the holy vessels to be broken and melted down for distribution among the poor. A little bit of an insight into St. Augustine's life as a bishop and his stewardship of the sources that are there. Probably kind of mixed, probably one way to think about that. Prayer requests, concerns, anyone, anything at this point? Sam, we will keep you in prayer for your home and for hopefully the damage is not too extensive. Any other requests or needs? No, all hearts are clear. Or at least you're just too cold. You just would rather just move on at this point, one or the other. I'll ask for a prayer request. Keep in mind, we are in general church meetings for the Church of the Nazarene, which means my mornings are completely absorbed in Zoom calls for around 2.5 hours. It's fun because I'm interacting with people from around the globe. It's also stressful because we're doing what normally might be done in a day in about a 2-hour period of time. So you can imagine the compression of those actions and activities. And many times we're making decisions, at least the last 2 days, that affect a number of our academic institutions, our schools, our universities, not only here in the United States, but around the globe. So just covet your prayers that we deal with them with due diligence and clarity, but also that we take time to really consider the implications of the decisions that we're making. I would appreciate your prayers for that. General board, some of you have heard that language before. It's when the interim leadership of the Church of the Nazarene between the General Assemblies, they gather once a year, and they'll be gathering at the back end of this week. And I suspect between COVID and some of the financial stress within the denomination, there'll be some really heartfelt conversations, to say the least, as they go forward. So, well, let me pray for us all as we begin, okay? Gracious God, we do thank you. I thank you for Augustine's vision, the kind of mediating position of both care for the poor, a desire not necessarily to always impede the development of your church, but definitely not to become entangled within that part of the process of what it means to be the church. Just thank you for the way in which he tries in his own life to balance that through the story. I do pray for Sam, for his home in the midst of the frozen pipes. I just pray that there was no extensive damage and that whatever challenge he faced will be reconciled. I pray you be with Rachel this evening, keep her safe with her family, and pray, Lord, that as the weather subsides, that she has access again to the church and the ability to participate within the class. I know probably in the midst of long, cold days that evening courses are a particular challenge, and that for many of us, just the stress of the day begins to bear weight upon us in the evening. And yet I do pray, Lord, that your Spirit would be with us, that in our conversations they would be helpful, not only for ourselves, not only for your church, but for your kingdom. And I do pray, Lord, that in the midst of our time together, that you would be working each and every member of this class, still acknowledging needs sometimes that might seem mundane or those who are just frankly too profound. Whatever is the challenges of our lives, the desires of our hearts, Lord, I just pray for your Spirit to constantly be at work in the midst of those, ultimately for the redemption of, the redemption of each of the students' lives, but ultimately, for the life of the world and for the redemption of all things. So guide us in our conversation this evening, in your name. Amen. Just very brief housekeeping. We're going to spend some time just continuing like we always have. I am going to reserve a portion of the time this evening to begin to talk about that little project you have by mid-semester where you set your own outcome for the class and how to begin thinking about that and the assessment for that outcome and how you begin to kind of wrestle with those. It's normally up until this point, for some of you, probably going practical what? And what in the heck is practical theology? And by now you may still be wondering what in the heck is practical theology. But I'm hoping that we've now covered at least enough of the landscape that you can begin to actually think about what a final project looked like for you and what kind of outcome would you want to accomplish. And so we'll spend some time deliberately sort of crafting that, at least getting you starting to think about that toward the end of this evening. Okay. And Ori, I don't know if I could book tickets for you to go over and do that ethnographic study. But if they're, but even you naming that, and Adam had sent me a note, just I hope you hear that part of the class really is, I'm hoping for you to find, and I'll just name it this way, something that really does kind of interest you, kind of desire of your heart that you could actually use a portion of this class as an excuse to pursue. The bad news, you also have to think about what the assessment looks like as well. But if you don't, I will. We'll make sure that happens. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to do the usual tonight. Since we've introduced, we'll get to Pete Ward, but this is the first time we've had a chance to read any of Osmer, and you have not read the whole book. You've only read the introductory chapter. But I thought that was at least an interesting enough chapter, maybe to kind of sit down and sort of discuss your understanding of that chapter. Just a reminder again, I just like these kind of journalist questions. So the who, what, where, when, and why. So, for him, how would he think are the primary actors in practical theology? Does he have advocates or adversaries? We may have to wait for Ward for that one, because I think that's more Pete Ward's agenda in his book. But what are the primary sources? When does it occur? Where? What kind of context is Osmer thinking about? And why do we do this? Or just kinds of questions to begin your conversation together, okay? I always do this, I try to do this early in the class when I'm hoping there's still some energy left on a Tuesday evening, so you guys can kind of reinforce and engage with each other. Sam, I'm going to assign you. Looking at the number of students, I think we will, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It will be even in their groups. So I know you may not be able to speak much if you're driving, but if there's any way you can kind of contribute, that'd be a good thing at this point.
I can speak. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, good deal. All right. Not trying to put you on the spot. If I can't talk to you, I'll just talk about you. So that's probably the best way that we have an agreement for the.
Fair enough.
Okay. All right. So let me set up the breakout rooms, and they'll be random as normal because I'm a kind of random guy. And let's see. All righty. And I'm going to open up all the rooms, and we'll spend about 20 minutes together. And then I'll kind of convene us back at that point. Okay. All right.
Delmy, I missed you in my group.
I said the same thing. Mi mangi molto, bello. I was missing you. I told the girls, I said, where's Ori?
Welcome to randomization, and I'm about as random as anybody can be, so that's okay from that standpoint. Conversation points. What came up in your conversations with each other? Always, I keep saying this. A reminder: you can go up to the grid view and you can minimize the PowerPoint slide if you want. You will get those. That way, you get to see each other's faces. But anything came up in the conversations just to bring forth for the whole group?
Definitely, I would say for ours as to where it happens. He talks on 14 and 15, those pages about the connectedness between academia and ministry, the ministry field. Kind of like how you can't have too much of one or the other. You can't have so much academia that you have no experience, and you can't have so much experience that you're not willing to learn, I guess. Sam actually had a good analogy for it. He says, okay, what was it, Sam? The something mind.
Just the head knowledge and heart knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah. Just talking about if you have too much head knowledge, how that, I won't steal. You keep going with it, Andrew.
Okay. But basically, you got too much head knowledge, but not enough heart knowledge, like being out there and stuff. The experience is just as important as the academic side of it. And so is saying to take what you've learned and apply it in some way, which is really what I would say practical theology is. Living out your theology.
Yeah. And it's theology and life together. That's probably one way to think about it. And that tends to resist either separated from the other. I mean, there may be times when things lead in that conversation, but just refuses that. So good observation from that standpoint. Other things that you talked about around Osmer, we'll say, you might have talked about date night, what you had for dinner. It's your time from that standpoint. But other things that came up from reading Osmer?
One thing that struck me was, and we talked about as a group, is, and Ward also touched on this a little bit, is that experience seemed to be kind of the kickoff point for the process. And we see that in the pastoral cycle, but also in the stories that Osmer talks about, is it's always an event or a situation or an episode, I think he calls it. And then that causes us to reflect, and then we act, or we discover new truth as a result of that. So I was just curious, what would it look like if it went the other way around, and we didn't have an experience that kicked things off, but we have a theological truth that kicks something off, and what would that look like in the cycle?
And we'll come back to that, but you actually can say one way to think about the cycle as a cycle is that if you come to the awareness of a new theological truth, to use that language, then what is its implications and application, which then leads to the testing of that, which brings you back into that ongoing conversation. So those would be the kinds of ways, but I think in some ways where it happens from Osmer's assumption, beginning with his own story, if you will, when he was a young pastor, as it normally comes up in the sort of the ruptures of life and ministry that tend to invoke that. Right now, you're paying money to be told to be theological, right? And then all of a sudden you walk into a conversation at the church and you find yourself in a whole nother space. So it really is a different kind of world from that standpoint. Not divorced from the academy and what we're asking you to do at times, but nevertheless, it's almost, and I think I can do this these days, but who gets to lead in the dance is one way to think about that. The dance here being a cultural expression, just for those of you who are Nazarene. So let's just name it for what it is. Keep it in the boundaries of the manual of the Church of the Nazarene. For those of you not, whether it's dubstep or disco, I'll let you figure that one out on your own. Okay. All right. Any other reflections or thoughts that come out?
We really appreciated that it's a collaborative activity. Kind of how, he asked questions, but he also, his definition of leadership was that it's influence, it's practicing influence. And so, just that process of learning from each other while teaching others and cyclical.
Okay, yeah. Matter of fact, and I'll come back, I will come back to that one there. So I'm trying to just settle my hands for a second, but that's a great observation. The other thing I think came out of your group. So did you feel Ward kind of threw him under the bus, or from that standpoint? I'll go ahead and name something. We're going to get to Pete for a couple of minutes and then come back to him later in the class. Ward has a very difficult task of describing lots of different approaches to practical theology while having a passion about a particular approach. And the hardest thing is how to balance description and evaluation. So, for instance, the same way with Bonnie Miller McLemore, you get kind of a feel of what I would call the traditional critical correlation approach and his assessment of that. And then the next week we read Gene Stevenson Moster, who is probably exemplar inside that movement. The same way he finally gets around to Osmer in the book, and now we're finally reading Osmer and getting him in his own voice. And truthfully, this is a tough thing. I feel for Pete in trying to describe different ways and approaches, knowing that you're trying to deal at 50,000 foot view, but sometimes when you're that high up, you tend to miss things too. So I'll just name that in Ward's treatise before it's all said and done. And some of that will come up tonight. Well, I'm going to do some talking, and you should have arriving in your email inbox the same case study that we've looked at in the past. You may not have it handy, so that's why I wanted to preside it. We're going to come back to Osmer and that case study one last time. I'm going to wear you out with the pastor threat before it's all said and done. So just stay with me for a minute, okay? I will go ahead and say just a couple words about Ward beyond what I've already said. See, Judge, and Act, that pastoral cycle, as he calls it, does really reflect just one method among many. Though I do think it tends to be more theological than Ward gives credit. And I do also think it tends to be more broadly experiential than the way he places it within Marxist thought. And Delmy, I know you reflected on that in your post. I'll have a little more to say about that. This is one of those guilt by association conversations that because certain people studied someone, then obviously they must be merely reflecting that thinking, to which I have long since disabused myself that anything I teach, you're going to automatically parrot in everything you do in ministry. So the fact I know I am not Yoda, I'm pretty sure most people who study under other thinkers tend to be a little more broad than just what that thinker is, and stay with me on that one. Or you didn't have to laugh on time at that point, but I get that.
I couldn't help it.
It's okay. The other thing he does mention that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time in this class is around the language of ethnography as a form of sort of practical theology. It is actually reflective. If you remember, I pointed out Ward himself curates this ecclesiology and ethnography group that he talks about sort of secondhand in the book this week, but he actually is affiliated with that organization, and that's where his real life approach kind of comes into play. So that's part of it. Those of you who have had a course with Dr. Wesley probably have already encountered some version of ethnography. If you happen to have been around here longer than just say the last year or so, and you've had coursework with Dr. Bill Selvage, then you know that basically for lack of a better way to say it, is I don't know what it is, but it busts me. Ethnography is sort of Bill's approach when he was faculty. It's either ethnography or folk religion. I mean, those were sort of his two passions and how they intersected. So if you leave NTS as a part of your academic career and never encounter ethnography, you somehow you have just missed something, to say the least, before it's all said and done, just to name it, okay? And for those of you in either the MTL or the MDiv, you can run, but you cannot hide. I mean, Michelle's book and others are just going to kind of catch you before it's all said and done, okay? All right, if you guys are going to play with Spanish and I get these flashes on the chat, it's going to get me, it'll probably distract me, but that's okay. I am going to mention a couple of other ways in which material gets played out, and one that I've taught a lot, and I'll come back to this, is family spiritual journeys. I'll explain that later. But Also, those of you who actually are in a class, and Adam, I think Stephen, you've had the class. Adam, I think you're with me this time around. But even the course on leadership, innovation, and design has versions of practical theology built around other forms of engagement, particularly through entrepreneurship thinking and design thinking. So there are myriad ways of engaging within this material. And practicing theology and even the Black practical theology are also versions of that. So yes, there are more there. I will go ahead and say this about, I'll say several things about Ward as it goes along, but his little section at the back end of that, of chapter, I always get my chapter numbers wrong, chapter 5, where he talks about theological reflection and chapter 6, sorry, and provides some guidelines on that. You might just hang on to that as we move forward, because we'll come back to that inside Osmer's model, and that's one place where the way he does that is really helpful. I think this is one time where trying to sync what Ward's trying to say and what Osmer's trying to say was a little bit difficult in this class. So I'll just name that for what it is. Just some things you already know, but just reminders. I tend to summarize material because I'm not asking you to do that for me. This is why I like you to connect where you want in the material and then go forward. Is that Osmer really, at some level, is really a practical theology of leadership. So if you want to say, what's the practical theology of, and then fill in the blank, for him, it is a kind of form of leadership that he has in mind. And that's a lot of the who and even the context of leadership that's important. What'd you make of his story? Can't think of the lady's name right off the top of my head.
Mary Jo.
Mary Jo. Were you surprised by the story or how it played out? No? Well, Adam, thoughts?
It was almost eerie. We were kind of going through a similar experience just in my local church here, and I think he nailed it right on the head with a lot of the tensions that he outlined. That's what I'll say.
Okay. Other thoughts about the story? So I go ahead. Story? Well, you'll get to come back to that. For a guy who grew up in North Carolina, by the way, whose family lives in the mountains, probably on the other side of the hill from where this event occurred, this story is almost spooky in how it reflects a lot of people I know. Now, my hunch is, for those of you down in the Oklahoma City area, if you have family anywhere, basically from the Panhandle to the Ozarks, you probably can get some of the personality is reflected as well. Andrew, where you're located in Pennsylvania, yeah, I imagine there's some of that same kind of feel. So I hope you hear context as a part of this as well. Kendra, I'm not sure about Florida. It really does. Orlando area, maybe so. You get up in the Panhandle, definitely. Down toward Miami, might be a different world from that standpoint. So just to name the rural context. Delmy, New York City, I got nothing there. I mean, I do think that's a different world all into itself from that standpoint. Okay. I do think this idea a couple things to pay attention to in his work. One is that he doesn't call this pastoral leadership, he calls it congregational leadership. And his acknowledgement of a broader view. I actually think that's connected to his own heritage and love for Christian education. For lack of a better way to say it, is that one of the primary focuses of Christian education is the upbuild of the laity. It's a very old famous term that used to be used a lot, but it really is an appreciation for and the need for an informed, empowered laity, and how that is as much a part of the leadership as the pastoral leadership. And Osmer is trying to pay attention to that. So I'm just going to name context at NTS. Those in the MDiv program tend to be focused more towards some model of clergy or ordained or pastoral leadership. Some of you are in this program are part of the MTL, which is actually designed to be both serving people in unique calls of ministry, regardless of whether you're seeking ordination or whether you're remaining lay. And so in some ways, Osmer's choice as a book is in part because he's mindful of both communities and what he's trying to accomplish and what he's doing. And he's not necessarily trying to privilege one over the other from that standpoint. You can determine whether or not he does that well or not, but I think that's important. We've alluded to the interconnectedness of ministry, the web, as he talks about it. This goes back to Deanna's thing, well, almost, but this language of interpretive guides, I hope you pay attention. If you're thinking about, and you're going to be building case studies, so the way he talks about where interpretation is needed, whether it is sort of what's going on in the community, one of the things you may think about is connective tissue, what's going wrong in the community, the ruptures, or what's going on outside the community that may have impact is one way to think about it. And when you think about case studies, so I hope you hear I'm doing a little coaching here, it is sort of what kind of a case study you want to talk about? Is it sort of around the interconnectedness and what leadership's entailed to make that happen? Is it in the face of ruptures? Or sometimes is it in dialogue with a broader conversation? All of those become part and parcel what you're doing when you're trying to, where leaders are called to be interpretive guides. Does that make sense? And I'm just reminding you of things I know you've read, but it's just a way of thinking about its application. It is kind of interesting, his idea of leaders as influence, but also communicators and collaborators, which I think is an interesting three-part way. There are people out there who write in leadership literature who make a real big deal, for instance, of leaders as influencers, and even sometimes communicators, but not necessarily collaborators. So there's a rather famous writer in leadership theory who's really more about influencing the influencers. It was a famous phrase of a previous era where basically the pastoral role is to try to get leaders on your side so they will accomplish what you want, a kind of transactive leadership model. And this, at least for Osmer, is more of a sense of community and how leadership occurs. And I think that's an important sort of assumption that he's trying to name really early in this book before he walks us through the cycle extensively. One way to kind of think of Osmer, and I'll explain more of this in the next 3 or 4 slides, is basically Osmer's approach is kind of Kolb and Dewey, meets Gherkin, meets Gadamer, which is probably the closest thing he gets to critical thought through the Frankfurt School, meets Reformed Christology. And in a way, Osmer is trying to hold all of that together. Rick Osmer wrote a dissertation on practical theology under James Fowler, just so you know, at Emory, that was 2 volumes. I think all told, it was somewhere between 750 and 800 pages. That was his PhD dissertation. Now, I'll be the first one to say he never should have written anything that big, and nobody should have even let him get away with that. But it just tells you how voracious he was as a student, even in his own research, trying to pull a number of things together before it was all said and done. And I'll come back, try to answer questions as we go, but let me just kind of point out the first phase of this. The reason I'm less, at least with Osmer, less attentive to just Marxist theory is probably because of his indebtedness to the use of David Kolb's work and the way in which he builds his theological work, his theological reflection. And this is the story behind the story. So And by the way, this is one of those moments that I really do feel for Pete Ward, because he named him as Daniel Kolb instead of David Kolb. And I'm going, only a Brit would get David Kolb's first name wrong from that standpoint. So it's just trying to deal with too much material. Kolb probably the best way to understand his work was he was an educator, adult educator, at the beginning of the adult education movement. And when a lot of people were trying to say, how is it that adults learn best? And what is it that if we're going to do adult education, as in, if some of you know, universities have degree completion programs and a whole host of alternative models of education outside of traditional schooling, like we're doing, albeit on Zoom here, then how do we understand how adults learn? And Kolb took some of the best of the educational theory, as well as other models of experiential learning or empirical learning, if you use that language, and began to kind of synthesize the work of Kurt Lewin and John Dewey and Jean Piaget, who was a psychologist, in some really pretty remarkable ways, and then created this kind of 4-cycle move that he sort of understands as the primary way of how most of us tend to learn, sort of in the wild, if you will. He actually uses this as a theory for adaptation. In other words, how we just sort of adapt and change over time, because he tends to think of us naturally as learners. And that's the primary way in which we sort of orient ourselves in the world. And at the same time, saw this as a particular model for learning through experience that he thought was important. So let me explain this, and then as I talk about it from Kolb's perspective, I think as you read Osmer, the points of connection will come out pretty easily. Okay. So Kolb says that basically we do encounter an experience, and so like Dewey and John Dewey, who was actually an American pragmatist educator, had nothing to do with Marx, for instance, from that standpoint. Basically, the argument is we learn from the experiences we have in life. Now, and that's just, it doesn't mean we always learn well from those experiences. I think all of us have had one of those moments that we wish we could take back, but that we do tend to learn that way. So what Kolb says is we do tend to first encounter experience. So good example would be, for instance, and I'm trying to use just an everyday example. If I decided that it was time for me to go to the grocery store in the midst of the snow and sleet that we've had here in Kansas City. And so I would just get out, and then I would be driving down the road and maybe slide off the side of the road for some reason, maybe get to a stop sign and slide right through it. That's an actual experience that we would tend to capture our attention. So we prehend or grasp experiences, and the quality of our prehension sometimes is based on the intensity of the experience. That shouldn't surprise any of you. I mean, most of you probably go through part of your life where I suspect even today, where you went through an hour of the day and you couldn't really give a detailed accounting for every minute in that hour, right? For instance, have some of you actually driven somewhere and you arrived, but you couldn't remember how you got there? So we don't always grasp fully what's happening in the moment. My wife reminds me of that regularly, just to name it that way. But something profound, like sliding through a stop sign, for instance, might at least capture our attention, to which we would then, if we've apprehended through that direct experience, we would then reflect upon that moment. Now, that the initial reflection may be gut level, like, help me, Jesus. I hope you hear that. But then we would also wonder at some level, why did we slide through the stop sign? And it could be, and then we would then, out of that, begin to consult, if you will, concepts and ideas. This is the abstract conceptualization of the rational reasons for why we went through that stop sign. So we might reflect upon, yes, the relative speed. So if I'm doing 35 miles an hour coming up to a stop sign and trying to stop on a dime in freezing temperatures with slick streets, that might be the rationale for that. Or we might reflect on the quality of our tires, or who put the stop sign there in the first place. I mean, I hope you hear there might be many things that we wrestle with, or why did I decide, why at this point in the day did I decide to go do that? Out of that, we would create a principle, if you will, by which we would then choose to operate in the future. This is under the abstract conceptualization. Sorry, those things I just mentioned, we would reflect upon. We would consult with those possible ideas. And so we may come up with a premise. Number one, for instance, that when I'm driving on snow and ice, I will never exceed the speed limit of 10 miles an hour. Or I will always give myself 4 times the stopping distance as I come up to a stop sign on slick streets. Or I will make my wife go out to the grocery store instead of me anytime it's snowing. I mean, there could be a number of operating principles that we would put in the abstract conceptualization. We might even consult, and this would be Dewey, the funded experience around us. So we might Google, what's the average stopping, average length between cars during slick roads, and how do I account for that as a part of when I choose to begin to stop at a stop sign? I mean, I hope you hear, it's not that we just come up with it de novo. We might actually think through, we might even Google, for instance, what's adequate traction in tires and when should you change tires. So we might consult the funded wisdom of other people, but we finally come up with an operating principle at the bottom of the wheel that we would then apply, experiment upon. We would actually use it. And maybe the next time we're driving on slick streets, we might go slower, brake sooner, and see if that actually works. It at least keeps us from sliding through the stop sign or not. Or we would send our spouse out and then pay the consequences in another form and fashion as a result of it. But I hope you hear there might be different options we would try. And then based on the experience, in my case, if I told my wife to go because I was afraid to drive, I know exactly what the response would be, which would mean I'd have to work the wheel again as a result of that. Does that make sense? And we do this. I mean, Kolb would say at one level, we just do this. We both, in some ways, we always have moments where we're asking ourselves, do we really know what we've experienced? How well is our apprehension? When we get to the bottom of the wheel, do we really know how to convert that into an operable principle by which to go forward? What's a good way of comprehending that idea? We intend to internalize the experience and we externalize the idea, if you want to think about it that way. And for Kolb, he would just say the wheel goes round and round and round. And so go back to the idea. So could an idea, even a theological thought at the bottom, show up? It's new. Yeah, but we would want to probably test its veracity by still working the wheel to see what happens the next time we try that. Now, it's one thing to learn a theological truth and test that out by writing a research paper for the professor in a course like theological inquiry here at Christian Faith Theological Inquiry at the seminary. It's another thing to test out that theological truth by preaching it on a Sunday morning. But we're still doing that same kind of model of adaptation. Well, pause. Does this make sense to everybody and how I'm taking you through this? Kolb's little idea, one way to think about it, has become just a massive initiative that both he and actually his wife, Alice Kolb, have continued to champion as a model of learning by and through experience. And it includes different types of learning styles. The slide's not real clear, but if you were to take congregational discipleship with me, for instance, you would take the learning styles inventory, because Kolb would say not all of us tend to work the wheel with the same amount of attention in each one of the four quadrants. So some of us tend to focus more on the experience, for instance, and therefore we like to either see how the experience plays itself out, that's called diverging, or we like to take ideas and see what the experience does, that's called accommodating. But some of us might be more focused on the thinking dimension instead of the experience dimension. And so we may like to take multiple ideas and try to pull them together. That's the assimilating. Or we like to take this one big idea and go, how does that work? It's kind of the engineer question, which is kind of the converging. So don't give me a lot of ideas. Tell me the one I need to know, and then I can tell you how to make that work. Does that make sense?
Just a quick question. You mentioned a slide. Are you showing slides?
Am I not?
No.
I just texted Dr. Blevins too.
You know, this is one, shoot. Every time I come out of the break, somebody needs to say, Dr. Blevins, please show your slides, okay?
Can you start over then?
Won't start all the way back over, but I will visualize this a little bit for you.
The real
just so-
question is what break?
Huh?
I said the real question is what break, Dr. Blevins?
What break? When break or what break?
What break?
You mentioned coming out of break.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you were
Yeah,
describing it so
Coming out
vividly, and
strong.
you were
You were
describing
all-
it so well. I thought I didn't need a slide, so I.
Yeah, nice try. I mean, somebody's looking for his class participation grade to go up. There's no doubt. Okay, so here's the slide, and you'll have this available. So concrete, reflective, abstract, and experimentation. That's the base way is how do we grasp something? How do we internalize it through reflection? How do we convert that into a principle that we know about? And then extend that knowledge back into experience through experimentation, and the wheel goes round and around. And then the other piece is this one. And I will show this. I'll go ahead and show this, and then we're going to be taking a break in a couple of minutes. So maybe not right away. Let me get through a little bit of Osmer. So bear with me for a minute. But I will show this particular website, and I will provide it as a link a little bit later. Where is it? There's a website called Experience-Based Learning Systems. That sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry somewhere, I know. But it includes all of the research and resources that both David and Alice Kolb have created. And I'll just be honest, they continue to curate all the research and papers through their site. And there's a lot of energy in and behind this particular work. We have used it. I don't think anyone here, Stephen, you might be aware of 365M. It was a place where we've utilized this model. Some of the supervised ministry currently is utilizing this model of kind of how do we draw from those particular pieces. Okay. Okay. Yeah, you guys kept talking Spanish, so I closed the chat. Never mind. So let me go back to the slide for just a minute. PowerPoint. And just say that there is a whole host of resources that come out of this model of experiential learning. Now, the reason I say that is that Osmer, I think, has at least some indebtedness to the way he envisions working the wheel, albeit through a theological frame. One of the earliest versions of this actually came from one of Osmer's students, Kendi Cressy Dean, who now teaches at Princeton, where Dr. Osmer is probably headed close to retirement. And she oversees youth ministry there, and may be one of the top 2 or 3 leaders in youth ministry, on par with Andy Root, who we're reading for this class. And so I tend to still use her categories as a beginning point to help you connect from Kolb to Osmer. So Dean says that really the challenge at the top of the wheel is naming what's really going on do we truly understand the fullness of the concrete situation before us? And so the goal is to name that moment of apprehension is a moment of truly naming the dynamic elements of what's going on. And so the task is to understand fully as you can that concrete situation. And then the reflection, the next component, is the reflection upon the present practice going on underneath that particular situation. So we name the situation, and then we begin to reflect on what are the practices, what's happening underneath that circumstance. Everybody with me so far? Okay. Then Dean says we then detect at the bottom of the wheel both the convictions that are driving this conversation, and we begin to evaluate the quality of the practice. Now, for Kenda Cressy Dean, this is where she often will talk about theological rocks. That detection and evaluation is explicitly a theological task from that standpoint. And so what we're asking is the practices, is what's happening in the midst of the situation, is it faithful in light of, you could use the language of theological tradition. She would probably just say, what we're doing, is it faithful to God? Is it faithful to the life of the church? And if not, why? Or if so, why? And if we need to change it, why? And so that acting like a detective is basically being a theological detective and trying to now make sense of what's going on in the midst of those underlying practices, and decide whether we need to change them or reinforce them, or what are we going to do about that? And that takes us to the transform moment, where we take our convictions and through practice, we basically are beginning to transform and project a more faithful ministry going forward. And that tends to bring us right back into yet another concrete situation, and the wheel goes around in a way. Okay? At times when you're in Osmer's work, this kind of naming, reflecting, detecting, and transforming, not experimenting. This is one reason that I do prefer Kenda Cressy Dean. She doesn't say we just experiment on an idea to see if it might work or not. What we're trying to do is transform what's going on toward a more faithful ministry and a more faithful ministry practice. And so there is a very intention and the activation, the extension of the knowledge that we have going forward. So that's why I tend to include her right alongside what we'll be reading in Osmer. Okay? But I hope you hear, even as I do that, that in some ways this naming, reflecting, detecting, and transforming really still include his words, a descriptive empirical task that goes to the naming, but we put our arrows, this probably would look better, an interpretive task that's a part of the reflection, a normative task that's part of the detection, because we really want to know what would be the best way to go forward, and then what he calls a pragmatic task in the transforming, because we have to enact it. We have to actually act upon it. And this is where Osmer is listening to a little bit of what we would call North American pragmatism. Again, not so much Marxist understanding, but it isn't how we tend to think about pragmatic. In our contemporary language, we tend to think about pragmatic as what works, right? And sometimes we get accused, well, you're just being too pragmatic to really need to be more theological or more faithful or more pastoral in what you're trying to do. Pragmatism for Osmer, it doesn't quite fit that kind of zero sum, just show me what will work kind of mindset. But it is this idea that it has to be worked out, which is one thing that North American pragmatism has always argued. It's got to be able to be worked out. for it to have viability. It doesn't do any good with the famous phrase, well, somebody ought to. At least within this mode, the somebody's going to be you. So what would you do? And what difference would that make? And that is a part of what we'll be talking about as we go forward. What I like about Osmer, and this is one place where I would argue that Ward maybe doesn't do enough with Osmer, is that Osmer doesn't just think, and I'll back up 2 slides for a minute. Whoops. Going the wrong way. Osmer doesn't think that theology just occurs at the bottom of the wheel. Remember, from that standpoint, Osmer really is trying to argue that theology is involved in all of these domains. So even as we are naming a circumstance, he will encourage thinking through the theologically shaped perceptions of what we see in that moment. So he might challenge us not only to describe the event, but name grace in the midst of that event. He's not afraid of that. When we are reflecting the underneath activities that are going on, Osmer doesn't mind us to also include a kind of theologically framed imagination that really reflects upon even ways of seeing the story or the event, the concrete situation, in a way that is through God's eyes or through God's perception. He will still say that it is kind of focal at the bottom, at the detecting, to ask the normative question. So what are we going to do from a theological standpoint about this circumstance? I mean, what is, and he does say at that point, if you're not doing theology throughout the cycle, pay attention at that point. And then, much like we're involved in reading courses on reading material and practicing theology, he does assume that transformative practice is going to be theologically mindful in the way in which we do that. So it's not a crass pragmatism. There really is more of a theological practice going on as a part of the work. Does that make sense to everybody? And we'll slow down for a second. Okay. That will take us to the 4 tasks that he's going to unpack for us throughout the rest of the book, and that he will build around his Christology, kind of reformed Christology. I don't think it's explicitly reformed. He just is acknowledging his tradition. But at least this goal of priestly listening, sagely wisdom, prophetic discernment. And he does tend to take the office of king and turn that into servant leadership, is the way he tends to think about it. Remember his deep appreciation for leadership, not only with the pastoral office, but also with the total life of the church, the leadership that's available. And so he wants to make sure that leadership is sort of built inside that model. And as we read the rest of his work, we'll spend time sort of playing around with how do you get into each and every one of this fourfold movement as it goes forward. Okay? I'm about to lose my place, so okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and let me just see, are there any questions with what's been presented so far? Or this is mainly a recapitulation of what you've already been reading, but just want to make sure if it helps. Okay. Then why don't we take a 15-minute break? And then we'll come back, and all I'm going to have, the reason I'm using the same case study is I don't want to slow you down spending a lot of time being at home with the case study itself. But when you come back, we're going to basically read the case study for a 3rd time and actually think through Osmer's categories, his 4-fold categories. You might even then go back. One way to think about it is actually to read that case study with the way in which he did. Oh, I can't remember names. The way he began with the story with Mary Jo James, And then if you remember, he then revisited that story the second time, showing how his method might ask whole new questions. And so what I want you to do is go back and take a look at that case study and say, using his 4 categories, what would you want to know more about that case study than what we've talked about up to this point? Does that make sense? And then we'll just sort of work the wheel inside that story, and then we'll come back and talk about it a little bit more. Okay? All right. 7:32. See you guys at 7:47 to create, just to put you back in small groups. So be here so I can put you in the small groups. Okay? We'll see you then. For Kendra and Andrew. Okay. Well, I may go ahead and break this. Just I'm mindful of time tonight. Let me just say it that way. There's Kendra. So let me, and Andrew. Good. Okay, everybody's back. So just a reminder, again, what we're going to do, and to do this, let me share. So you have ye old case study. Everybody I trust can see that at this point. And again, it's still about Nora and it's still about Stanley. So you got that already. And I hope you, one of the reasons I have you do the same case studies, just so you can kind of become familiar with it. This time around, though, what I'd like for you to do is to, hang on, just ask the sort of, so in light of that case study, what else would you want to know about the concrete situation? Just what more would help you in sort of doing that? What other kinds of questions do you have about sort of the underlying practices that were governing what was going on at that time? Are there certain theological categories that you would want to know more, either in how the church feels about it or just that you would want to apply? And then what else might you think could be done for the sake of faithful ministry going forward? Now, the last one I'm less worried about. I'm more wanting you to kind of focus on the concrete situation and the underlying assumptions or reflected practices and the theological. So if you can get through those 3 turns of the cycle, that'll be fine. So if you're, so you're just getting sort of hitting the empirical task, the interpretive, and the normative task from that standpoint. But the best way to say it, better than me giving those categories to work with, that's just an easier way to engage the material, is what would you want to know more out of this case study to be consistent with the way Osmer tried to know more out of the experience that he encountered. Does that make sense? All right. So let me put you back in breakout for about, I'd say 15, maybe 20 minutes at most, but closer to 15. I just want you to start getting the sense of working the cycle and what that looks like. Okay? All righty. I'm seeing nothing but smiles with one group, so something tells me I caught you in the middle of an inside joke, to say the least.
I think we were just all lamenting how we deal with Nora's from time to time.
Okay.
And for that matter, Stan's as well.
Yeah, I won't go there, but that's from that standpoint. So we're missing Delmy, but I assume she'll be back. She'll probably use this as an opportunity to sneak away for a little bit. So, okay, well, let's see, in a way, working the wheel. So from that standpoint, what were some things that, and hear this language again, that you would have liked to know more about? So there's no, and I always say this, case studies can never give you everything you want, but what were some things working the wheel that you would have liked to know more? So in naming sort of the concrete situation, oh shoot, did this go backwards? No, it didn't. There we go. In naming the concrete situation, what were some things that came up that you would have liked to know more just about the encounter, the experience that was talked about?
We talked about wanting to know about Pastor Stanley's upbringing, his family, his experience, and exposure to relationship with women, his relationship with his wife, if there's a wife, how was that? Also, we wanted to uncover more about Nora and her, she's been with the church 35 years, so she has a lot of power. What's her relationship with her husband? And he's deceased, so maybe he was the gatekeeper or the fact check,
Okay.
and the peacemaker. And also, what was Pastor Stanley's stance on women's roles in ministry? I mean, Nora came with the package as he was in ministry 4 years in. So those are, questions that.
And most of those, and tell me, those are good questions, but I hope you hear working the cycle. Most of those I would tend to be reflect on the present practice. So
Gotcha.
What's going on underneath Pastor Stanley's family history would be, I think, one of those kinds of things, as well as view of leadership. That might get closer to detecting, but still it could be here, mainly because would we have a particular view of women in leadership, and particularly regardless of age, particularly their right when it comes to having their voice stated and understood, would be part of it. But to kind of go back to the concrete situation, I mean, even thinking about the precipitating event, are there other things you would really want to know about that first congregational meeting, or the first time he sat down with the leadership in the women's ministry area? I mean, women's missions board. Would it be other things you just want to know? It's almost like it really is almost playing journalist from, is there anything else you want to know about what was going on that started this conversation?
One thing we mentioned is that the meeting itself, like that, and where she made the motion, that's just the flashpoint. There's more, like there's more leading up to that, and we theorized that it was a lot to do with vision of and the expectations of what Stan's leadership role is supposed to be, being that she pointed it out later on that the church has lost membership and under his leadership, and she doesn't feel he's qualified for this. So that's a clue, but I'd like to know more how Nora maybe interacted in previous meetings to this. I mean, the case study doesn't have it, but that's something I'd like to know more, and how Stan actually runs the meetings as well.
Okay. And that might be more, that last question might be important. I mean, right now, what we have, at least, and I'm looking at the case study. I hope you guys got this on your screen right beside you or can access it. I'm looking at lines number 2 and 3. Basically, the first thing I want to know is, what kind of church membership meeting is this? And what does that mean? I mean, is this all church gathering? Is this why would this be a surprise? And what is that meeting supposed to do? It's almost, I hope you hear it's like somebody said, I can't believe somebody said this at the meeting. Well, what kind of meeting was that? Why was that there? So you start by almost looking at before you even get to the underneathness. Do you really know what the purpose of the meeting was? Why that happened? When they do meet, the next concrete suggestion, for instance, is reactions at the board meetings. So what's going on in those meetings? And why? I mean, the why would be the underlying practices, maybe, but what really happened? How long do those meetings run? Is this the kind of thing that, if she interjects stuff, does it stretch meetings out? Those of you who have been members of church board meetings for just a moment, who know the difference between a 1.5 hour well-run church board meeting versus a church board meeting that runs, as I've been a part of, 4.5 hours. And what, and the what in the heck's going on in the midst of those, I think just becomes, again, I hope you're not being chastised in this. It's just, how do we get at what's really going on in that concrete moment, is part of what Osmer's trying to force us to pay attention to. Does that make sense? So since this is a seriatim of 3 or 4 events, including his meeting with the missions team, for instance, knowing exactly what happened in each one of those, you would almost feel like you are in almost a court of law, sort of. Please explain clearly and concisely. And what you're really trying to get at is, are you missing something from that standpoint? Does that make sense? Now, I want you to hear, that's not to take away anything. Tell me what your group had already begun to summarize. That really is part of that reflecting on present practice that you're also trying to get at in the underneathness, because that is where, in some ways, the truth of what's motivating these events, you're trying to interpret that and make sense of that in the midst of everything else that's going on. Other things, Delmy, thank you for other things you and Adam have spoke. Anything else that came out of the groups that you saw that you talked about, either in the concrete or the reflecting on present practice?
I don't know if this, I guess, goes back to reflecting or not. But the role of the pastor in discipleship versus the role of the board in discipleship, did she have anyone else that should have been having these conversations? Did he expect someone to, be discipling her, become like growing her as a leader? If they already had a past relationship with her for years, would he have expected that someone else would have handled it? Or were they all wanting him to deal with her?
Okay. So in a way, whether it's discipleship or handling conflict, either way, if you want, which to me is one and the same thing, but in some sense, how has this church tended to deal with these kinds of challenges in the past? And does it tend to fall to the pastor? He's been there 4 years, but even before that, does this happen?
Well, yeah. Is there documentation of her doing something like this in the past and someone else has called it out? Or is this literally the first time it's ever happened and it's a commentary on his leadership? Or is it, if it's happened in the past multiple times, it might be more of a commentary on her?
Right. Or a commentary, and hear this language, a commentary on the church.
Sure.
So Ed Freeman wrote a book on basically applying a kind of family systems or theory to congregations, where in that book, he noted that certain churches tend to cycle through ministers on a fairly regular basis, where pastors would come in and be there for 3 to 5 years, sometimes 6, and all of a sudden some kind of chaos would occur and the pastor would move on. The church would lament. They would bring another pastor in, and you, almost like an identified patient, about every 5 or 6 years, the pastor becomes the person that embodies that system and the pain and the guilt that church had. One circumstance that he documented, a church had for over 40 years. And this was their way of dealing with almost generational guilt. And the title of the book is From Generation to Generation. And it was really a book exploring pastoral leadership in churches that have this kind of cycle of activity. And so a question you would want to ask at this point would be, is this something new for Stanley to have this kind of a conflict? Has she had conflict before? Well, that might raise questions just about her. But as this church had pastoral turnover or pastoral trauma, if you will, about every 4 or 5 years, and we just now living this out fresh and anew, maybe with a different person even, but it's a pattern that tends to replicate itself. Does that make sense? That's a kind of underneathness that you might, unless you may not have even thought to ask originally, but now with leadership back as a question. Remember, with Gene Stevenson Mosser, the focus was more on the living human document. So it was really more about the persons of both I'm going to lose names, Nora and Stanley. And a lot of our conversation was there, partially out of the way she approaches case study and that narrative. But if you come back and you now talk about churches as dynamic systems, almost like families, now you're asking another layer of what may not. I mean, they may go, "What are you talking about?" None of our pastors. We've had 2 that stayed 20 years each, and then we've had a couple of short interims. But no, that's not an issue at all. But if you don't think to ask, then you don't know how that might impact the way in which you're doing the leadership. And now we're back in a book that's really about leadership, not just pastoral care, but the underlying question is, what's the interpretive leadership that needs to be at work taking us forward? Does that make sense? Other things underneath that you guys might have talked about or anywhere else in the cycle?
I think, in a lot of areas we were focusing on the pastor. And in some ways, what if Nora was going through the cycle and as a saint in the church, what if she was to try and understand the situation and make it more concrete? What are the expenses that were accused of being, all of that. And so it wasn't just running the pastor through the cycle, but also Nora.
Yeah. And frankly, that, for lack of a better way of saying it, no matter what Stan thought I didn't misuse the funds, which is kind of how the case study states. What the heck was the issue about what funds and why? Is the same question of why would you be mad at a swing set? Well, there's a reason, but we don't, but if we don't know to ask, and if it were Stanley, truthfully, if I'm sitting there in a meeting and somebody says, move that the fee set by the women's ministry for serving at weddings we recognize as belonging to them, I might be offended too. And then you might pause long enough to go, why weddings? I mean, is that the only thing they do? Is that one of certain things they do? Now we're back to understanding the concrete situation, but now we're getting what's Nora's relationship to all things weddings. So all of a sudden you're starting to ask a more precise kind of concrete question. And then how is it maybe Nora dealing with weddings? Remember, in her own life, the loss of her husband and what that might imply. Now we're a little bit more to Gene Stevenson Mosner again, but it still is a leadership issue from that standpoint. I mean, if it had been about funds, belonging to something else, the annual bazaar at the church or the bingo, or which obviously means it's not a Nazarene church. But if it were, something like that, does that raise a different question than weddings? It's just getting at the underneathness. So that's a good observation from that standpoint. All of these have been. So I hope you hear that. Any others we kind of tried that you talked about that came up?
I don't really know where this fits in the cycle, but I thought about, what emphasis does the church or the church board put on pastoral, prophetic discernment? He seemed super surprised, super taken aback. Is that his personality? Is he just not asking these questions? Or is the board or the church not encouraging him to take space and, think through these things?
Yeah. And I think that's, if you think about categories at the bottom, the detecting. So what is the role of the pastor? from a theological perspective. And so what is, what, I mean, and again, Osmer's going to push us because he's talking about prophet, priest, king, that kind of language. And so he's already interjecting theological language that would force us to ask questions. So, what is the expectation of a pastor as prophet? Or is the pastor seen more as a HR manager or from that standpoint, or just someone to shepherd and maintain? So the functional image of the pastor is sometimes not just a underlying issue, but it then forces us. So what would you want a pastor to do from that standpoint? That's more of a sort of a theological view of ordination, for instance, or a theological view of the laos, the role of the laity in relationship to the pastor. Those are core ecclesiological questions that often from one tradition to the other are quite normative in how we understand what that looks like, or from one congregation to another are quite normative. There'll be some churches to even stand at a meeting and question the pastor, albeit indirectly, would be something that would be just, not just be a shock, be a slam to the system, versus other settings where it might not be seen as threatening. So what's going on in the ecclesiology underneath, and what does it mean to be a faithful church? Would be kind of the detecting the convictions, and what, or even asking question, what is stewardship and what's the role of people in light of the money? Do they feel like they own it or are they merely stewards of those funds? And how do they approach that? To return back to Augustine tonight, how are these funds being used, and would they be for the sake of the poor, for instance? And would that have priority within that working ecclesiology? Does that make sense? Other observations out of the case study?
I think one of the other things we were talking through was, okay, so if Stanley does do this appropriately, he understands the concrete situation, he reflects, he detects, he figures out, or he gets to a better spot to make decisions, then the next step is what? He then needs to help Nora walk through the same thing so that she can understand where he's coming from and reflect. And so he's almost doing the cycle twice, but walking her through all those steps.
And helping guide her through the same thing. The nasty thing about this case study, and it was on purpose, by the way, is line 88. So finally he decided it would be best to, and you're going, well, I could go ahead and tell him what he needs to do next. Well, could you? Because that next step is faithful ministry. So you're hoping that he would do that. Not necessarily just say, well, tell her to get a clue, but what would be the pastoral, in this case, pastoral response? Osmer would say, for any leader, including the leaders of the board, what would be the appropriate response to Nora? And how would we go forward from that standpoint, particularly if it's a collaborative circumstance? As a matter of fact, one way to work through this cycle is if pastoral practical theology, as Osmer envisions it, is collaborative, it would be almost asking, who else would you want to talk to at each turn of the wheel, at each point in the wheel? If it goes back to the meeting at the top, would you want to go to somebody and say, did you just hear what I heard? Did I hear that right? Are my assumptions correct? Or do I need to get a second opinion on what was actually happening in that meeting? When it gets to the underlying practices, there'd be a lot of different people you might want to talk to, and a lot of spade work. And when it comes to theology, would you want to do the theology for the people and explain to them the Nazarene ecclesiology, maybe read them the article of faith on the church and say, deal with it? Or would you want to work together to create what that theological vision looks like? And as you go forward, is it just Stanley's role? Is it just the board's role? Is it just Nora's? Or what might be required for all of them to move forward from that standpoint? Everybody with me? Now, let me stress again, the reason I kept the same case study, you could do this with different case studies, but part of the goal is learning to see from within the case study the variables as it unfolds, because guess who gets to write the next case study? It ain't Stanley. And that's part of why I want you to start sort of wrestling with this now. Just so you know, and I'm going to keep going for the sake of time because I'm mindful of the time. So let me get back where I want to be. I'm just going to do this backwards. Next week, let me just go ahead and tell you what you need to do next week. I want you to know this now. We're going to begin to work on a case study. Now, eventually you're going to write a full one, but next week you're not going to be writing a full one. So I hope you hear that. So you're not coming, but I want you to start working the wheel. So next week, can you provide at least a clear description of what, of something that happened? And I would not say just pick something out of your life experience that you think would make for a good case study. So something that you've encountered. I would say relatively fresh, maybe within the last year. So at least, you can, if questions come up, it's not something that happened to you in ministry 5 years ago. I would have trouble if it happened 2 weeks ago, recalling all the pertinent detail. I'm sure all of you are much brighter and much sharper in your memory retention than I am. But pick something that you can visit as an actual event. See if you can start with the gist of what happened. So it's almost like you are having a cup of coffee and say, well, let me tell you what happened at the church one time, or what happened at work. Or so you don't necessarily have to be congregationally based, but it could be something, but it's normally better to do that when we get to the theological standpoint. But and this is why I like Osmer. So I'm looking like at Adam right now. This is when you might have been exercising leadership in a congregation, not as the pastor, but still exercising leadership in the congregation, in the way in which you interacted or interfaced. I will say one of the things that I'm just going to encourage is that you write it out so you can explain it, so you've got it written. I would not pick something super painful, or super damaging, only because you want to be able to give the account and not have your own pain wrapped up in that conversation, if at all possible. Okay? This is just, you may want to deal with that in the second case study that you're doing, and you have the right to do that. But a lot of times, and I'll just name it this way, what trauma does is that it tends to cause hyperfocalization on certain aspects and not necessarily others. Now, it might have been a circumstance, and that's why I used the word painful. It might have been a circumstance when you were irritated or maybe just outright angry at the circumstance, but how much it took personal pain that you felt a deep sense of loss or trauma, those are the ones I would be cautious in using. Does that make sense? And we're doing a case study, and I'm not trying to minimize where people have been through painful experiences. It's just that the course is not designed to address that in the same way. Okay. Then I'm going to ask you, you'll be meeting in small groups again next week, hint. So I'm going to be asking you to explain it in 5 minutes. And I'm only asking you to explain the event, not all the underlying stuff, just the event. Sort of, can you name that concrete situation? But you have permission to start sort of asking what might be some of the underlying issues, to sort of suspect what those might be. And you can even ask yourself as you're writing it, what might be a kind of core theological category? Could it be a particular view of salvation, the role of the church, understanding how God is at work in the world, Could it be about, since we've mentioned this one, and it's an important one within our tradition, the role of women in leadership theologically. So that could be to me, that's a theological category. That is not just an underlying issue. And you might think about possible applications, but I really want you to hear, much like we started tonight, if you can really, in 5 minutes, feel that you have given the circumstance well, or maybe 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and maybe in those other 30 seconds, just sort of get at the underneathness of it. We're going to come back to spend more time on those things as time goes along. Does that make sense?
I have a question real quick.
Sure.
So the case study that we read intentionally left out certain details, right? Like it seemed pretty apparent they didn't want us to know everything about everything. Are there specific like things that are helpful for us just to be vague about, like maybe people's roles or their relationship to us, or do we just get to pick? Or
what limits your decision making is the amount of time.
okay.
Case studies can't give you everything because you can't write a book. So most of the time, what limits is what do you need to say in a given period of time? And that's the most important thing. So you're prioritizing the whole time you're writing a case study. Does that make sense? And that's why there's no harm or foul. I mean, I want you to hear this. So you can, at any point, somebody says, have you thought about this? You can say, well, obviously, but I just didn't have time, whether you thought about it or not. So, and I've had that happen. So I just want to name it that way. But more importantly, what do you feel like you need to say to understand the situation concretely? We'll be reading more in Osmer. He'll be pushing you even further into the wheel. I just want us to have enough to come together that we can begin talking about those other elements when it's all said and done. Okay? Any other questions? All right. We're basically going to be working the bicycle wheel. We're just going to be more doing a tricycle this time, so that obviously when you come back from spring break, you can actually be in a 10 speed massive bike and really pedaling away and doing it quite well as a result of that. But I just want us to, much like we did tonight, using somebody else's narrative, this time it's actually using something we've encountered, so that we begin to kind of get a sense of what a case study might feel like that we create. Okay? And I always say this, the case study is to help us learn the wheel, not to justify the quality of the case study. So if there are elements that don't always show up, that's okay. But the better you do the practice, the stronger you'll be able to work the wheel. All right. Scared yet? No, don't be scared. Okay, good. Let me go back. I did want to mention a couple things about Ward. I did just only because I promised you this. One way to think about what Ward's doing, particularly in this chapter, but across the board, is that he's just reminding us that engaging practical theology can vary. Now, he tends to privilege some over others, but really the reason that you adopt different methods, and we're going to learn one, and that's Osmer's. So we have at least one. And I tend to argue it's as Osmer says, it's a spiral. It's not that you just do it one cycle and you're done. You're constantly spiraling around and expanding as a part of what you're doing. But that really, when you get to all those other versions he talks about, the complexification, even Fowler's faith development, which was a little bit odd the way he describes that, but I don't have time to offer a rebuttal tonight. What he's trying to remind us that sometimes you vary your model because context matters. And what you're doing may require a different approach before it's all said and done. Or that theological assumptions matter. In other words, when you begin to engage that material theologically, that becomes something that sort of begins to shape the way in which you do your practical theology. What I'm about to say may surprise you, but action varies, both on the divine and the human side. What I mean by that is the Spirit of God is at work, but not always exactly the same way in every circumstance. Hope that makes sense. That there are times when God is acting in particular ways that we can't dictate nor much less predict. And that might then cause us in how we're doing our theology to vary how we approach it just because of how God shows up in those moments. But also because humans don't tend to act in the same ways. I mean, some cases lend themselves more toward leadership. Some cases lend themselves more toward pastoral care. Sometimes the theological reflection is more around discipleship. And the task in those moments are really based on what do people need and how do I do the practical theology I need to do in such a way that it actually fits within the context and the needs and the actions of the people I'm engaging. And so there will never be just one model. What I'm asking you to be is, can you just be at home in some ways with the fact there are models, different approaches, but not feel like you necessarily have to be entrenched in only one and reject the others. And if you can be at home with one by the end of the semester, that's the most important thing from where I'm coming from. Does that make sense? As a matter of fact, in the program at NTS, since those books are there, depending on which class you might have or how you engage me in different classes, you will find different expressions. I've already alluded to the fact that I teach a class on family spiritual journeys, which is a kind of spiritual direction with families. And Diana Garland's work is really a kind of ethnography working with families, but it's not a traditional ethnography. She's looking at how families practice their faith and understand their spiritual life and then discerning how to build out from there. I've used practicing our faith in several classes, particularly around formation. And when you encounter practical missional theology, Reading's missional theology, you'll find that David Wesley and I share a book, Participating in God's Mission, just because we're coming at things in slightly different ways. I've used ethnography. I don't use it as much. It seems to be the domain of a couple of other faculty more than me, but I have used different qualitative studies models. And yes, I've even used Osmer's notion when it comes to theology in dialogue with outside. I've engaged in a lot of work between Christian formation and neuroscience over my life. And when I do those, I have to sometimes vary the way I'm doing practical theology in light of the way in which it's needed in those different contexts. I hope that helps. You're going to be exposed to this in several places at seminary, and they all do have slightly different nuanced ways of engaging action and being reflective in the midst of action that you're going to encounter before it's all said and done. As a matter of fact, a lot has changed. This is the last part of Ward's chapter. When it came to the way we have traditionally understood the theological disciplines. And so if you were to be at NTS, I'd say 10 years ago, probably, maybe definitely 15, you would have found that most of the work was based on very discrete categories, biblical studies, usually historical critical, just kind of very narrow in their approach, church history, quad church history, and you probably would have been memorizing hundreds of timelines and really kind of knowing it that way. You would have engaged in dogmatics or systematic theology, one right way to understand theology and how God is at work in the world. And if you were here, particularly when Al Truesdale was here, you probably would have gotten kind of a religious studies, kind of how either Christianity dialogues with other religions, or you would have gotten traditionally an apologetics course, which is actually very popular in some programs right now, in the old way of doing apologetics, why we're right and everybody else is wrong, apologetics, okay? And then you would have had your traditional classes like preaching, worship or liturgics, administration, pastoral care, evangelism, Christian ed, spiritual formation, that's sort of being built on top of those platforms, all underneath basically still a kind of enlightenment foundational philosophy that says there is one right way to know your Bible, one right way to know your church history, one right way to know your theology, or particularly systematics, and maybe even why our way is better than somebody else's way, and then how to apply that. I actually have colleagues who still sort of adopted this approach, some of them at undergraduate level, that still are sort of framed that way. But today, what's happening is, in the light of what we call a post-foundational, that is not relativism, but a kind of understanding that foundations were pretty much, and I'm just going to name it this way, European, white, male, and their orientation. That context was not being paid attention to. It was merely assumed that our context was right. Now we do pay attention to context, and we're trying to respect those while maintaining, and this is language that Pete Ward uses, this critical realist perspective. We still believe there is a God at work underneath doing some marvelous things that is revealed, but we do know that there is a kind of layer of context that we can no longer dismiss as a result of that. I'm watching the clock, so I'm gonna have to go fast. That has meant that we have classes now on Bible, but it's with sociology and even reading the scripture in context. Some of you probably already hit that class. Or when we talk about church histories, we're really talking about communities and global world history, or we're talking about local histories, even how we understand a particular tradition in a particular place. Theologies are becoming more constructive again, or more open. Now that was true 20 years ago here as well, but at least this idea of respecting theologies and seeing how they dialogue with each other, including something like a Black practical theology or a Latinx theology as a viable theology that needs to contribute to the conversation. And actually the funny one is that religious studies is really now more about, and I know Ori checked out right now, but it's really more about the participation within a religion and the ritual and the implications of that, even for the Christian life. So I bookended this with 2 books. Exploring Ecclesiology is an interesting book. It's a straight up book on ecclesiology, but every other chapter is about life and practice in the church. And so it takes you through all the traditional categories about doctrine of the church, but every other chapter is a practical theology expression. They cannot do one without doing the other. How do you talk about the church if you're not talking about practice at the same time? In James K. Smith's book, You Are What You Love, is kind of theology meets Augustinian desires meets ritual studies. All of that's being woven together from that standpoint. And it has changed the categories above. So we're still doing some of the usual stuff, but now you're starting to see conversations around public advocacy, interreligious dialogue, and more that's expanding the fields and making things far more complex, but actually more exciting as a result of that. I hope that makes sense as we go forward. I'm going to allude to something. I'm going to give you guys a 5-minute drive-by. Actually, no, I think I'm going to do this next week. Shoot. Yeah, it's too complex. So I will wait next week. If you are wrestling with determining what your outcome is going to be so you can figure out what your assessment is, I'm going to guide you through that. I will move it up higher if need be so that we make sure that we get that covered next week, because I want you to have a couple of weeks to know how to write your outcome and then think about what your assessment's going to be. Okay? A lot of information each week. I apologize for that. I hope this has been helpful tonight. I like the small groups. I mean, I've learned a long time ago that wrestling with the material is not about mastering. It's about engaging each other, engaging with the material. So we're going to continue doing that as we go along. Okay? All right. Any questions before we go? No? All hearts clear?
I got one about the presentation after reading week. I think you had mentioned last week or the week before you'd be going over what your expectations were for that.
Yeah, well, can I hold that then until next week? Because that's tied to this. It's just that you have to be perfect or otherwise. So,
Okay.
which I know is for Canadians is just a simple challenge. So from that standpoint, so no, I'm just Adam's like I needed this, like I needed a hole in the head. Yeah, I will go ahead. I will name that. I will say that I'm expecting your case study to be written, hint, and then we'll talk about how well, what standards are for it. The simplest line is that you've worked the wheel in your case study, and you know, and it's very clear that you know you've done that. So it's a little bit artificial, but you've actually done that, and you know how to hit the marks on each one of the elements of the wheel. The good news is we're going to spend the next 2 weeks just talking about that more than anything, right?
Perfect.
I really want you to walk out of class in 2 weeks, ready to walk into the break, and you're already writing as a result of what we're doing. It's not like you got to stop then and see this as a spring break project. Anything else? Tell me, or were you going to ask a question, or you just shifted gears? Okay. Blessings, everybody. Go home. Go sleep. Well, you are home. Just have a good night's rest, and we will see you guys. If you have questions, I'm not shy. Send me an email, okay? All right. Blessings, everybody. Take care.
Good night, everyone. Ciao.